What's going on, guys? It's Nick here, back with another video. Tough Draft Day Choices, Episode 2. We just broke down Joe Mixon and James Conner. Today, we're going to break down Christian McCaffrey and Alvin Kamara. But before we start, let's do the stat of the day. The answer to yesterday's stat, remember there were two answers, were Julian Edelman and Sterling Shepard. Brett Thunstrom got Julian Edelman first. And to this point, no one has gotten Shepard. Doesn't mean someone can't, but no one's guessed them yet. Today's stat of the day: which running back with at least 125 carries had the highest percentage go for 20 or more yards? This was last season, not every season, just last year. Among running backs with at least 125 carries, who had the highest percentage go for 20 or more yards? Remember, you can download my rankings and my projections for both the draft and the regular season at our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. But let's start with the breakdown. And let's start with Alvin Kamara. And Alvin Kamara has finished as the running back 3 and 4 in half-point PPR scoring over his first two seasons as a pro. And what's great about Kamara is that he's one of those players that can produce for fantasy even when the rushing numbers aren't elite. You know, in these two seasons where he's finished as running back 3 and 4, he's had 728 and 883 rushing yards. That's incredible safety, knowing that he can produce elite numbers even when those totals aren't that high. In back-to-back seasons, he's had 81 receptions, and his touchdown totals have been 13 and 18. And you guys hear me say all the time that touchdown totals are more random than people would like and more random than people think. But that's more the case with wide receivers, and it's for sure not the case with Alvin Kamara. He's the top option on a top 5 offense in the league. Last season, Kamara had the 16th most carries in the league. So out of all carries everywhere, 16th most. However, he had the second most inside the 20, the second most inside the 10, and the fourth most inside the 5. He's a goal line back on a top 5 offense. Every year, these guys are top 5 offense. He's the goal line back. He's the top red zone option. The Saints have been 3rd and 4th in scoring over the past two seasons, so you know that these touchdown numbers are going to stay elite. And let's just not look at the rushing. Let's look at receiving. He was also 5th in targets inside the 20 and 16th in targets inside the 10. Those numbers were the most and the second most among all running backs respectively. So not only is he getting a ton of goal line carries, every time they're in the red zone, they're also throwing him the ball. So he has elite touchdown upside. And again, like I said, they've been 3rd and 4th in scoring over the past two seasons, so they're going to remain elite. You just know they're going to be up there every single year. Also, Ingram is gone. And while I do think that Latavius Murray takes over the Ingram role pretty much exactly, I think they just give the exact workload to Latavius Murray, there is a chance that Kamara sees a slightly larger role. There is not a chance that he sees a massive increase. We're not getting the Alvin Kamara we saw over the first few games when Ingram was suspended last season. That's not what we're going to get. Okay, don't think he's going to score 40 a game. But could he see just a few? He really only needs like one more carry and 2 more targets a game would just absolutely skyrocket his potential, and it's possible. And let's not forget Ingram's role, what he was taking away from Kamara. Ingram was 19th in carries inside the 20, which isn't crazy high, but it's pretty high for a backup. 15th in carries inside the 10, which is a lot, and 7th most carries inside the 5, which was just one less than Kamara. So while I do expect Murray to take over a lot of those, there's a chance that some of those jump over to Kamara, which would likely result in 20-plus touchdowns this season. So we can say without a shadow of a doubt that Kamara is going to have double-digit touchdowns for sure, upside for 20 touchdowns, and he's going to be around 80 receptions. So it really doesn't matter that he's going to see less workload between the 20s than other first-round running backs, because his touches have much more expected fantasy points. Those carries inside the 20, when they just line up and give him the ball at the 50, listen, that's not very many expected fantasy points. We don't really care if he loses out on a bunch of those. What we want are the upside carries and the upside targets, and that's what Kamara brings to the table. He's used more than anyone when the Saints get close to the end zone, and they get close a lot. And I also want to bring up an article that Scott Barrett wrote recently, and it was titled I think it was different ways to look at yards per carry. And the point of the article was trying to find regression candidates by looking at a few different metrics that are related to yards per carry. And the first is percentage of carries that gain positive yards. If a player has a high yards per carry but ranks very low in percentage of runs that gain positive yards, that's a potential red flag that they might regress the following season. Well, Kamara ranked second, only behind Gus Edwards in percentage of carries that gain positive yards, so that's a big positive for him. And another metric he talked about was percentage of runs that gain 20 or more yards. Kamara gained 20 or more yards on only 0.5% of his carries, and that's after doing so on 4.2% of his carries in 2017. So he actually had a down year in that department, so we can expect it to increase next season. These stats are essentially saying that Kamara is very likely to maintain a high yards per carry this next season, and if anything, it might increase a little bit with the addition of some long runs. Kamara does have my top overall projection from a half-point PPR look. His projection is around 1,100 yards and 13 rushing touchdowns, but also 79 receptions for another 723 yards and 5 receiving touchdowns. And again, he's got a very high touchdown floor, but also a very, very high ceiling. So a lot of praise for Kamara, but it makes sense. Both these guys are going in the top 5 according to everyone and every site. But let's talk about Christian McCaffrey. And I loved Christian McCaffrey last season, and I love him again this year. The offense struggled at times last year. At times they were dominant, but at times they struggled. But McCaffrey was the constant through all of it, and he was always a major part of the offense. He accumulated just shy of 2,000 rushing yards, and he had 13 total touchdowns, plus his 107 receptions ranked 8th among all players. And he was also used heavily in the red zone, ranking 4th in carries inside the 20 and inside the 10, and then 7th in carries inside the 5, although he was used a lot less than Kamara was as a receiver in the red zone, which was something that surprised me because he's got more total receptions, more total targets. He's used more as a receiver all across the field, but not in the red zone. He was used a lot less in the red zone as a receiver. So that was kind of interesting stat for me to find out. But from a total reception standpoint, no one compares to Christian McCaffrey. He has the most receptions through a running back's first 2 seasons in the history of the NFL, and he holds that lead over second place by 25 receptions. But it is interesting to note that Alvin Kamara is that player in second place. So we are talking about 2 players entered the league at the same time that have just dominated in terms of receptions for running back. McCaffrey was also very interesting in the touchdown department last season. He had 13 total touchdowns, and so when you see a number like that, you figure they're kind of evenly spread out. There's a decent amount of games with touchdowns, but 12 of his touchdowns came in weeks 7 through 13. So that means he scored just 1 touchdown in weeks 1 through 6, plus weeks 14, 15, and 16. Now, it also means that he went off in weeks 7 through 13 and probably carried a lot of teams into the playoffs, but those long stretches of no touchdowns are a bit odd, and it probably means nothing, but it is something to consider. It is kind of a strange thing that happened, and a potential reasoning to that could be Cam Newton. Cam Newton has averaged 7.25 rushing touchdowns per season since he entered the league, and that's going to impact the consistency of McCaffrey's touchdowns. And again, it's likely just randomness that the touchdowns bunched up like that, and there were a few games where they just scored a ton of points, and McCaffrey is heavily used in the offense. But know that Newton is going to take some red zone carries. He had the exact same amount of carries inside the 10-yard line as Melvin Gordon did last year. So it does lower McCaffrey's floor, and it does lower his ceiling just a little bit. And looking back to that Scott Barrett article, if you guys want to see, how did McCaffrey rank in these categories, McCaffrey was 7th in percentage of carries that gained positive yards, and he gained 20 or more yards on 3% of his carries, which is about average. That's like typically what you'd kind of expect players to jump around. And that basically means, what we saw last year and what we've seen over his career, that's Christian McCaffrey. That's what we should expect. His 4.6 yards per carry, 3% of his runs gaining 20 or more yards. He's not really going to regress positively or negatively. That's what we see. Last season is what Christian McCaffrey is. My projection is 250 carries for 1,144 yards and 6 rushing touchdowns. plus 96 receptions for 859 yards and another 6.5 receiving touchdowns. I think the next time I go through and do the projections, that will decrease on the total carries front, probably to around 220, 225. But for right now, that's where it's at. But again, if you guys have the premium rankings and you see it dip, know that I do expect it to dip the next time I go through them. If you're wondering where that compares in terms of total points, well, if you're talking about standard scoring, it's 15 less. In half-point PPR, it's 7 less. But in full-point PPR, it's 3 points more. So a lot does depend on your scoring format. But who do I take? Remember, all of these are going to be for half-point PPR because it's a good mix of what everyone does, and it's probably is the best format and the most fair format, I guess, for all the positions. Who do I take? I'd like to open by saying that I love both of them, and I would absolutely 100% draft either one of them in any league that I'm in. But for this, and if it did come down to it, I'm drafting Alvin Kamara. He's only finished as the running back 3 and the running back 4. He's got a larger red zone role. His team is likely to score more touchdowns. He doesn't have a quarterback that's going to vulture any touchdowns on the ground, which means that there's going to be a lot less variance in his touchdown projection and has a higher ceiling. He's also going to see positive regression with these long touchdowns, and Ingram is gone. And so there's at least a chance that he sees an increased workload. McCaffrey wins with the receptions. I'd be a little bit surprised if they both played, 15, 16 games and McCaffrey had less reception. I'd be pretty surprised. But it's just not enough to make up for the touchdowns. And the touchdowns just being so safe with Kamara, you just know where he's going to be, and you know that he's got so much more upside in that department. Could McCaffrey beat him out? Yeah, certainly. I mean, again, touchdowns are slightly random. But I'd be a little surprised, and if we played the season out 1,000,000 times, Kamara beats McCaffrey in the touchdown department in most of those. And since that's how we have to think, I've got to take Kamara. So remember, you can have my rankings and download my projections for both the draft and for the regular season at our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. But that is the end of this video. I hope you guys did enjoy. If you did, how about we hit that like button? How about we subscribe if we are new? And thanks for watching.